Welcome back to the Sactown Crossover. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Rhino and Sactown. If you're joining live on YouTube, Twitter, go ahead and lob us a comment. We'll get to those or a little chat in a minute. If you haven't already, go check out our last two episodes. We had Nando Diaz of Miami Sports Vibes talking NBA playoffs. And before that, Jerry Reynolds to wrap up the NBA season. But great to have you with us. And before we get to our guest tonight, I do want to tell you about Bennett's. Sactown Crossover is brought to you by Bennett's American Kitchen. Locations in Sacramento, Roseville, and soon to come in Rockland. Check out Bennett's for all of your dining needs. Amazing cuts of steak. Great seafood, and also awesome specials on the weekends. You can find a prime rib special Friday, Saturday, and Sunday brunch. Go check them out again. Bennett's Kitchen in Sacramento, Roseville, and soon to come in Rockland. All right, so let's get right to it. My guest today, you probably hear him all the time. He's a graduate of the University of Rhode Island sports radio veteran. Currently the host of Cattles and Rami on Sactown Sports 1140 Monday through Friday, 2 to 6 p.m. He is Nick Cattles. Nick, how you doing tonight? Thanks so much for joining the crossover.
I'm doing well, Ryan, man. Glad that I could join you and find some time to talk with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming in, Nick. I know your schedule is busy. So you're from the East Coast. You got your first taste of Sacramento starting out in 2019. What's it been like so far, Nick?
Well, I'll tell you, man, I've enjoyed it. You know, Sacramento, of course, it's all about, the Kings, and this fan base is tremendous. And that's one of the first things that I noticed right away. Look, being on the East Coast, you don't spend a ton of time watching Kings games, especially because they weren't on national TV, as we know, for a while. But I did have the league pass, and I would check them out from time to time and keep an eye on them. And, the Celtics, who I covered an awful lot a few years back, they had that Kings pick going back a few years ago. Actually, one of the best seasons the Kings had before this season in the last 16 years, as luck would have it for Celtics fans. But, yeah, I mean, I love it. I mean, the weather is great, and the people have been really cool. And just to be part of the experience this year as the Kings won was pretty just awesome to be part of that vibe and be down at the G1C and be down at Doco and just feel that and see so many people who were, that live and die with this team, be there every single night and cheer them when they're awful and cheer them when they're playing well. It was really cool to see a lot of those people kind of embrace this playoff run. Sure. Unfortunately, it ended, but it's been a great time, man. It's a cool city.
Very cool. And yeah, you said you covered the Celtics. I know you covered the Patriots too a little bit, right, Nick?
Yeah, actually, I do a little side project, little side hustle. It's a Patriots podcast with Greg Bedard, who's, he's worked at a bunch of places, worked at SI, the MMQB. So I do that, and I covered the Celtics back when I was working in Boston for a few years. And so I kind of went back and forth between Boston and Virginia, and then I came out here in, December of 21. So yeah, it's been about 18 months or so since I've been out here and can't complain.
Yeah, I hear you. Different weather for sure. Late summertime, no doubt. Yeah. It's hot. But what's the difference between the fan bases? Obviously, the Celtics, storied franchise, big city. How does that differ from your experience here in Sacramento?
I'd say anger. Look, being in the Northeast, I said this, and you realize it when you come out here to California, because you would see that, in California, and I'm not talking about Sacramento, I'm talking about LA, and I'm talking about, Golden State. You'd see some of these crowds, show up a little bit later, and you see, when those teams aren't playing well, crowds aren't showing up. And, you wonder from the Northeast, you're like, California crowds, they kind of get a rep of like, they don't care, why are they showing up late? They're front running fans.
Yeah.
Then you realize, man, it's really about like the weather, bro. Like the weather in the Northeast is brutal. And, you're all you have in the Northeast is sports for about 6 or 7 months out of the year. So, being in California, it's like, now I understand it. Hey, man, if the team's not great, I can go hang outside at 75, 80 degrees and sunny. This is beautiful. and there's just more stuff to do out here. So I would say that, New England is a little bit more suffocating as far as being a fan. It's a little bit more aggressive being a fan. I went to a Giants-Dodgers game last year, and I got a kick out of people just kind of joking around. And, there were Dodgers fans were all throughout center field. And I'm like, man, if this was Fenway, and I didn't see any fights, I'm sure a fight or two happened, but I didn't see any fights with these eyes. And I was like, man, if I'm at Fenway or Yankee Stadium, which I've been to, both places when they're playing the opposite, the rival, right? Like it would be a little bit different. I don't know if they'd allow 1,000 fans in center that's draped in Dodger blue like they were when I went to Oracle Park. So I just a little bit more aggressive at times, angry. Not all fans. There's reasonable, logical fans as well, just like anywhere you go. But it's definitely a little bit more intense in the Northeast.
Interesting. Yeah. And what's funny about that, Nick, is the Giants and Dodgers rivalry is actually one of the hotter ones in baseball in NorCal. So funny how that works. But, you go to a Kings-Lakers game, then it's a little bit different. It can get a little bit more heated. But so everybody that listens, I started the podcast, obviously, huge Kings fan, done some stuff on the side with the Kings, or about the Kings, I should say.
Yep.
But really why I started it is I decided I wanted to make this my career. This is where I wanted to cross over into, hence the Sactown Crossover. You have been a veteran of the radio game, Nick. How did you get started? Why did you get started, and what's your journey been like?
Old school way, man. You mentioned I went to URI. I graduated with a BA in journalism. The original plan was to do writing. I'm a big fan of writing, and I wanted to be a journalist. And when I got there, I had a class with this professor. His name was Professor Pantalone. And I remember him saying, like, hey, if you want to be a newspaper journalist, it's great that you have a passion for it and all that, but I want to tell you a few things. He said, number one, you're not going to make any money. And if you make money, it'll be maybe 10, 15 years down the road for most of you. So keep that in mind. And then he said, there's a thing we call the internet. And so he said, get ready for digital to take over, and probably less jobs and all that stuff. So he said that, and I just kind of tucked that in the back of my head. And I was doing play-by-play. I always loved sports, and I always listened to sports talk radio. When I'd say mostly I started listening to it like early teens. I wasn't into it like younger than, 12 or 11. I get 13, 14, 15, 16, started listening to it, and never really thought about like, hey, that's what I want to do. I actually was more interested in play-by-play, and I did play-by-play for men's and women's basketball. I did play-by-play for the football team at URI. And in the meantime, I interned. I interned at a station called 790 The Score in Rhode Island. And I interned there for a little bit and met a buddy of mine who is still a best friend to this day. He's actually the assistant program director at 98.5 in Boston now. And he was working with me at 790, and he said, hey, man, you should just like try to board op, get a job. If you want to make a little bit of extra money, get involved with the station. That's what I did. I board opped games. I board opped Yankee games in a small little room downstairs, like a little basement of the station building. And I did that for a bit. Then I quit because, I wasn't making money. I was like 24, 25. And I'm like, man, I was living with my mom in a 1-bedroom apartment. I was like, this isn't it, right? Like, I don't want to, it's not where I want to be. And so I ended up leaving, and I left radio, and I worked in healthcare for about a year or so. That was awful. It was a cubicle job. Mm-hmm. I got it through my cousin. My cousin's done some big things in the healthcare finance world. So I did that for a bit. And then honestly, Ryan, I was just floating around for like a year or two during, I don't know how old you are or anything, but, back in like 06 to 08, the economy was bad. Everybody, a lot of jobs were lost, and I was part of that. So I was unemployed for about a year and a half. Got a job with the Pawtucket Red Sox, and thought I might do some minor league baseball stuff. And then they laid me off from the seasonal work, and I started to get into real estate. And I'll never forget it. My buddy Jim again, he called me and said, "Hey man, they're starting a station in Boston, and I think I might be able to get you connected with the PD." I was like, all right. So connected with the PD, man, and worked on the midday show as the second-hand producer with my best friend Jim. He was the main guy.
Jim's the man.
Jim's the man. Jim Louth is the man. So I worked with Jim in the midday show, and then I just kind of grew from there. So I went from producing, and then I started to do a fantasy football show on Sunday mornings before the Patriots pregame, which got my name out there. And then that led to me filling in on the weekends, and then that led to a weekend show, and that led into me, filling in for vacations and holidays. And then I applied for a job in Virginia Beach, and I landed that job in Virginia Beach and worked there for a few years. Got another opportunity in Boston, went back up. Wasn't really the right fit. It was the night show. Me and the co-hosts were very kind of opposite as far as we approach things and stuff. And went back to Virginia, spent a few years there. And while I was in Virginia, ESPN Radio, I made a connection with ESPN Radio, and they brought me on. I worked for ESPN Radio National for about a year or so before the pandemic hit. And then just kind of kept working in Virginia for another couple of years, and then came out here. Got connected, and got reached out to, and it was like, hey, are you interested? And so that's kind of where it all led to here. And then I was PD and host for the first year here, and now I'm just host because 2 full-time jobs, bananas, don't do it.
Yeah, you got to enjoy California a little bit.
Yeah,
you got to live California.
I love this, man.
Exactly right, man. Nick Hattle's joining the Sactown Crossover, so that's a heck of a story, and it seems a lot like I hear. You bounce around, you take whatever you can get just to keep climbing, and you ended up filling in for Will Kane at some point, right?
Yeah, I did. So I did a show for Will Kane. It was me and Myron Metcalf. We did. It was on ESPN News. It was around the 4th of July. It was a Friday. One of those like crazy things. I flew in from Virginia into Connecticut, and I did the show on ESPN News that day. And then like the next day, woke up, flew right back to Virginia. So I did a show for Will. That was a pretty cool experience. It's kind of like a bucket list thing, I guess. Like you could say it checked off the bucket list that you did a show on ESPN TV. So that was kind of cool. And I was fortunate because I did some, in Boston at 98.5, they had a deal, a partnership with NBC Sports Boston. So some of the shows that I would fill in on, they had TV and cameras and stuff all set up. So I was somewhat used to that, which made it a little bit more comfortable. I can't imagine, for the first time hosting for Will and doing a TV show on ESPN News with, zero experience in front of a camera probably would have been a disaster. So that was cool. And then, I don't want to say it was cool because of the situation, but really the thing that I'm honored the most about is that I actually, it's one of those unfortunate situations, but it's one of those moments that, when you're in this business, if you have the opportunity to do something, you're like, man, that was pretty memorable. And that was unfortunately when Kobe passed away. I was working at ESPN Radio. It was a Sunday. I was filling in for a Sunday afternoon show on the East Coast. And I remember, man, I was flying out of Virginia down to Miami for the Super Bowl. It was the Sunday of Radio Row Week when Kobe died. It was that Sunday, I guess you would say, morning here.
Yeah.
The next day I was going to be on Radio Row Monday in Miami. So I was able to squeeze the show in before I flew out. And wouldn't you know, man, like I'm sitting there doing a show with, I think it was Mike Wells of ESPN. And wouldn't you know that, we get word of the helicopter thing and Kobe's passing. And, I had the unfortunate responsibility to share with the world that Kobe just passed away on ESPN Radio. So it's one of those things where, again, it's not that you want to do it, but it's definitely one of those experiences that you get through and you're like, man, I don't know if there'll be anything else, in my career that could kind of match that intensity and in that moment. So had some experiences at ESPN, and then the pandemic hit and they kind of let go a lot of the part-timers, and that was pretty much it.
I can't imagine covering something like that, Nick. And especially I would imagine a moment like that you're not prepared for, but in some ways it's probably like you forget you're on the radio and you're just talking to a friend. because you're, sharing memories about Kobe. Obviously, you're reporting, the specifics of the accident, but, it's not like, okay, this is seg 1, seg 2, seg
No,
3. You're
yeah.
just spitballing, and, I mean, what was that like for you? Was it surreal?
It's crazy. I mean, I had some, I've done shows on very emotional days. I did a show in Virginia when, the Boston Marathon bombing was happening. And, I went through that and, texting friends back in New England, doing the show, trying to make sure that everybody was, safe and sound.
Sure.
Unfortunately, they were. So, and you do shows like, I did a show on the day of, the Newtown shooting and stuff like that in Connecticut and all. So, emotionally, I think in this business, you try your best to compartmentalize, right? Whether it's personal stuff going on or you're in the middle of a show that is emotional and something is pretty heavy. You kind of just do your best to compartmentalize and push the emotion out as much as you can and kind of focus on the task at hand. And, when you're in that moment, it was more just like, I was really just running point, man, like, look, ESPN has tremendous resources, right? So I was back in Virginia, obviously, and they were back in Bristol. And, so they're kind of keeping you in the know as to what's going on in your ear as you're doing stuff when you go to breaks. And, they're shuffling guests, it's like, hey, we're going to get Magic, and then we're not going to get Magic, but we're going to get Michael Wilbon. And then, hey, we're not, we're going to go to Ramona Shelburne here. And so it's a lot of shuffling of the deck. And, the most powerful moment I think of that show was when we had Ramona on and she was driving home. I mean, she was driving like to the site or from the site, one of the two.
Mm-hmm.
She literally had to pull her car over because she just started like crying on the air. Like, and so you feel that through the phone and through the radio. And like Ramona is as professional can be.
Yeah. And
she was it hit her when she was talking to us. So that was probably the most memorable moment. And, the challenge, it was a really weird first few minutes because it had already hit online. I think TMZ was the first one that got it. And so TMZ had reported it. And a lot of other people started to report it on Twitter. And what ends up happening is like, when you're at ESPN, you can't run with the story until they confirm it.
Yeah.
So, there was like a 5 to 8 minute window that felt like 45 minutes of us kind of seeing it on Twitter and people like texting you and stuff and saying, hey, Kobe died, and you can't go with it. So so there was a weird moment where I think we were talking about like Russell Wilson. It was Super Bowl week. We're talking NFL. Meanwhile, you're seeing all of this play out, and you're like, man, looks like Kobe passed away. Like, this is crazy, but you got to keep the show going.
Yeah.
Talking about something completely different. And it makes you feel obviously detached from reality.
Right.
And then finally, Woj and Ramona, I believe both confirmed it to the news desk or whatever, as they call it. And they finally gave us the go ahead and said, okay, you can now report it and let people know. So that was a really odd, like 5 to 8 minutes. Again, it felt like it was like 3 hours.
Oh, I can't imagine, Nick. Again, Nick Cattle's joining us, host of Cattles and Romney on Sactown Sports 1140, 2 to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. So I'm going to transition you to a difficult situation, Nick.
Okay.
Just this week, you had Bob Huggins come on the radio. We're not going to go into exactly what he said, but said some very controversial things. The radio host ended up kind of going with it and, almost pitching in to a degree. So my question for you is, if you're a host in that position, what do you do? I know you got a dump button, but you've got a guest too that you don't want to disrespect on the air. How do you handle that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it really depends on your relationship with the guest, right? Like if you have, my reading of the situation, just hearing it, was that Cunningham, who was the host, probably is pretty good friends with Huggins. So the first thing I would say is, depending on your relationship with somebody, if they say something, you might have a completely different reaction versus if you don't know the person and, it might immediately kind of click. Now, for us, look, the homophobic slur and all that, like immediately something would go off in my head, and whether friend or not, you got to shut it down. You and your producer should take charge in that moment, and your producer should be the one that dumps it. And once that happens, you've got to come up with whatever you're going to say on the air, whether that's a friend or not. You've got to be able to handle it and say, all right, Bob, you either have to make a decision of you're going to divert things and you're going to go to something different quickly.
Yeah.
Or, I guess I would say that you might want to try to make is the wrong word. You might want to try to circle back and kind of lead Bob to an apology if you can do it smooth enough. Where it's like, oh, Bob, you certainly don't mean what you just said, Bob, right? We're, joking, and it might, you might have just you might have been trying to make a joke, but a little off color. You didn't really mean what you said right there, right? That's another thing that somebody might do. Honestly, if it were me, I would say goodbye. I'd say I'd have it. Again, the producer that I work with, JJ, and Simone's back there too. JJ would know right away. I mean, I don't know who the producer was. I don't want to pass judgment. It could be a young guy. Who knows who it was? But as soon as that is said, it's dump city right away. And then, especially that it continued to go on, you've got to get away from that, and you've got to, however graciously you can say goodbye, you've got to say goodbye and move on with your show and your day.
Yeah. Hey, Bob. Bob, thanks for joining us. We got a hard out right now.
Yeah,
so go, bud.
Hey, Bob. Hey, Bob. Thanks for joining us. We're gonna move on here. Again, it depends on the relationship. Like, and I don't mean by like it depends on the relationship. Like you would let that go. That's not what I mean.
Yeah.
It's how you handle it with the person themselves. If I have no relationship with the person, it's much easier to go, dump them. That's it. We're done. We're moving on. I can't believe what he just said. And then, if that's the case, it's one of those things where you just go, that was out of control, crazy, and slam it. Even if you're a friend, I think you have to do the same thing, but you probably do it a little bit more, softly, a little bit more with kindness.
Yeah.
Again, I would not defend it. I would not defend the language that he used if I was, Cunningham, and I certainly would not have been laughing and joking along with him. But different generations, different, beliefs and thought processes, and I'm sure, Bill, like I said, is a friend of Huggins. So it's a difficult situation. You can't dictate what somebody's going to say on the air. So you have to do what's best, and you've got to act responsibly. And again, if it draws a personal line with you, you've got to make sure that's known. And I would have made that known right away. And I would have tried to as gracefully let Bob go and say, we don't, I would have, I think, likely rolled out. And again, it's all in the moment, right? So you don't know exactly what you would say, but I would imagine I'd say something along the lines of, I don't condone that language in any way. I don't condone what Coach Huggins just said. That was, out of bounds. That's crossing the line. And we had to move on from the interview because there's just absolutely no space for something like that on my show, on this show. There's no room for it. That's what I would have likely said. And, I just think it's like one of those things again, man, it's sometimes you'll have like somebody curse on the air because you're like, it's just so like, and I'm not equating the two situations, but if you have a friendship with somebody and they come on as a guest, you always kind of keep in mind, like they might say more or do something that they wouldn't do with another host because you're friends with that person. So, and I don't know what's been said on that show before. Hopefully nothing close to that, but
not.
I think when something like that is said in the way that it was handled, I immediately wonder, has that happened before? Has it gone by before? And how was it handled that at that point? The other thing I would say too, Ryan, is, what I found, look, it was, the language was terrible. The whole thing was terrible. The way the host handled it, terrible. The producer not dumping it, terrible. It was all awful. And I think, I mentioned on the show today, Cunningham did not mention it on his show at all, after it got out. And to me, that's even more unconscionable, is that, it's rather obvious that the guy went above and beyond and used hate speech and hate language.
Yep.
And if you don't address it on your show, either if it's right after it happens, which you should immediately, again, that tells you that the host doesn't have the detector in his head and is just along for the joke and doesn't have any issue with that kind of language, which, I would obviously have issue with it. And so would Rami. But, even after like 24 hours of thinking about it, not talking about it, not apologizing for it, not coming out and saying it's on me, you join us for this show, that should never be part of this show. The fact that he just allowed it to linger in the ether and not address it directly, I think it really says a lot about the host. And I also think it says a lot about the person.
Absolutely, Nick. And I guess the university somewhat followed suit, right, with punishment. Yeah. So, I mean, it's just kind of terrible all the way around the way it was handled. So, Nick Cattle's joining us for just a few more minutes. So, I mean, Sacramento knows you because you obviously are on the radio 5 days a week. But, I don't feel like you've done a lot of interviews and such. So it's nice to kind of get a little bit more out of you and, a chance to get to know you a little more. How did you and Rami come together? What's that relationship?
So it's kind of weird, man. Things come full circle in the business sometimes. So before the pandemic, right before the pandemic, I had been reached out to from a station in Minneapolis. And they reached out to me and they were wondering like, hey, would you be interested in coming here? And so, well, we'll see. And let's talked about it with my wife, Kelly. And I was like, you know what, let's have a conversation. Let's see what happens. So they ended up giving me I ended up doing a demo for that job. And the demo I did was with Rami. So we did that demo and I knew kind of like first time doing a show with him, it was like through Zoom. It was pandemic time, it was like it was right before pandemic time. So we're doing Zoom. It was the best that we could do. So we did a Zoom show for like 30 minutes about the Timberwolves and stuff. And we talked about Karl Anthony Towns and some Twin stuff. And that ended. And I remember saying like, wow, that was, that we had some pretty good chemistry right away. Like it seemed like it went pretty well.
Yeah.
And everybody at the station said that it went pretty well. And then the pandemic hit and everybody kind of went to their corners, and that station in Minneapolis had to let go of a bunch of people, and Rami happened to be one of the people they had to let go. And so he ended up in Milwaukee and I ended up out here. And then we went to the hiring process. We knew we were going to hire a co-host for me. And he was on the list of names that stood out to me because I had that experience with him beforehand. And so we just went through the interview process. We had a number of good people that were, considered, and we brought Rami in for a visit and we did a demo. And I had done I did a few demos with a couple of different co-hosts and thought about it for a couple of weeks. And then, kind of just listening back to it, I just felt like the show was what I wanted the show to be. And I also felt that, being a solo host, Ryan, like you kind of get wrapped up in your own world and your tunnel vision.
Sure.
And, if you hang out with me having a beer and you're hanging out with me on like a Friday night, I'm going to joke and bust balls and do all sorts of stuff. And, so I consider myself, I'm sure I'm biased, but I consider myself a pretty funny guy. But when you're doing solo stuff, you're so wrapped into the content. It's really tough to be funny by yourself in a room. It's really tough to be funny doing a solo show. And I felt like if there was one weakness about my hosting amongst a couple of other weaknesses, but the major weakness to me was I needed to loosen up, have fun, and bring that humorous side out of me so I could be more complete as a host. because a lot of people got the opinions and a lot of people got the passion and the intensity and all that stuff. But they didn't always get the fun. And so I just thought Rami was, he brought such a different vibe to what I would do solo to a certain extent, that he would bring out the best in me. And in the other way, I would hopefully bring out the best in him. And I think it's really kind of gone that way. And we have a lot of fun, but we also, hopefully when people listen, we also have a lot of things that we talk about sports wise. And, we're both pretty analytical when it comes to looking at sports. And, we both do a lot of, research, and we both, work our butts off to watch things and read things. But there's the funny side and the more loose, relaxed side. And I think that makes us more relatable. So that's how it all came about, man. I'm happy with, I'm very happy with the end result and what we're doing. And it's, I've said this to Kelly, it's probably it's either the best or the second best time that I've had in my radio life has been awesome. The last year with him, because it's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Okay, so I know I got to get you out here in a second. You're going to get this analogy once I say it, but It's kind of, because it's going to be my last question. It's kind of like when the WWE pairs up like a monster badass baby face with one of those baby faces that's got like one of those goofy gimmicks, but can actually kick ass too. Yeah. It's got that feel.
Yeah. So you're giving me the Kane and the Daniel Bryan tag team.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. We're on the same page. So speaking of WWE, Nick, you made a trip to SoFi Stadium for WrestleMania. What's the deal? Are you a WWE fan? What was the experience?
Yeah. Die hard pro wrestling fan. Getting ready to watch AEW tonight, but
nice.
Diehard wrestling fan. I've been a diehard wrestling fan for a long time. I got into it when I was younger, like a lot of people do. I then got away from it when it got really dumb, when Vince was doing like the plumber gimmicks and all that stuff, and it was just brutal to watch. And I got back into it like a lot of people did during the Attitude Era, 97, 96, 97. I got into the Monday Night Wars. And I haven't left since then. I've been a diehard for now 25 plus years, and I love it. Yeah, Kelly and I went to WrestleMania. We went to both nights. It was the second WrestleMania I've been to. I went to 30 in New Orleans, which was awesome.
Nice.
I attempted to get a job with the WWE years ago, and almost did. I almost, I had an interview with the HR guy. I'll never forget his name. I think his name was John Weiner. But I had an interview, like a pre kind of screening HR deal.
Yeah.
With the WWE to be a writer. Because what I did was I actually wrote an episode of Raw, and I typed up a letter to Linda McMahon, and I said if I'm gonna go for a WWE job, I'm not gonna send something to Vince, because Vince is not gonna pay attention to it. He's Vince.
Yeah.
I'm not going to send it to a fellow writer, because there could be paranoia or whatever the hell.
Right.
So I picked Linda, because I figured, I was like, well, Linda is at the top of the food chain. And if I impress Linda enough, she might actually, hand it off to somebody and get me in contact with somebody. So I remember doing it, man. I had my like resume, and I had the cover letter to Linda, and I had like an episode of Raw written out.
How long did that take you? How long did that's a 3-hour episode, Nick, or 2 back
then. So, all right, I'm going to let you in on how much of a nerd I am. And this is smooth by you, by the way. You're going to keep me longer when you get me talking about wrestling. So when I was in college, I did a lot in college, Ryan. I had a lot of fun in college. But when I was in college, when I was bored, I would literally write longhand episodes of WWF. I would, I'd write, and at that time it was Raw and SmackDown. I'd write Raw and SmackDown, and I had a separate black book that I kept all the matches and the dates and stuff so I could keep track of who was, I was
fantasy booking.
Yeah, man, I was literally writing episodes of the show and including commercial breaks and all that stuff. So by the time I sent that to Linda, I had so much practice at coming up with shows and episodes that I don't know, it probably took me, maybe a couple days And I probably went back and tweaked it. I don't remember every single, detail of the process, but it probably took me a couple of days. And I'm sure I went back and I read it because I was going to send it to Linda. And I put it in a big manila folder and I sent it out to Stanford. And a few weeks later, I got a phone call from WWF HR and they left me a message. They left me a message on my phone and I was like, holy shit. I don't know if I could swear. I was like, oh, good. I was like, man, that's out of nowhere. So I had a phone call with the guy and phone call went well, but it was like one of those things where I had just gotten back into radio and I hadn't done a lot of writing in radio, like enough. What the guy basically told me was, hey man, if you go back to radio, write some stuff, write some bits, and then reach out to me and, we can do it. And we could talk about it. So it took me like a year or two to get back into radio. And by that time, it was like I was kind of in the radio world. And, in that moment, I don't think that it would have been good for me anyway, because then I found out that I have an inner ear issue, flying and stuff like that. So I don't think I could fly every week if I was working for the WWE. But it has always kind of been a dream of mine. Like if it wasn't hosting a sports radio show, being a part of the creative team. I've worked, I worked in the indies, I worked in.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I worked in the independent circuit when I was younger. Primal Conflict Wrestling was the place it was called. It was in Rhode Island. I got to work with Tommy Dreamer and Balls Mahoney and Sandman and some of those. I drove New Jack to the building from the airport.
No way.
Yeah, yeah. So some pretty cool experiences when I was younger. And then I actually got back into the independents when I was in Virginia. And it was so funny. The dude was like, hey man, you wanna help me come up with the TV? They were doing like local cable stuff, right? But they had a spot on local cable every week. And the guy was like, you want to help me out or whatever? So I sent them a couple of samples of he gave me like the roster of guys that he had. And I kind of read up on him and all that. And I wrote a couple of episodes for him. And I was like, here's what I would do, And so guy ended up bringing me in and I thought I was going to be part of the booking crew with 2 or 3 other people.
Yeah.
And then within 4 or 5 weeks, I was the booker. And I'm like, how did that happen? And which is a really crazy thing, man, because the wrestling world's political. And I was surrounded by a bunch of sharks and
gotta pay your dues, Nick.
Yeah, I know. I built some rings, man. I built some rings when I was younger, but I was like, hey, all right, this was some guys would go into business in their own way. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But I remember I wrote the first television we did, the first episode I wrote, Ryan, and there was this angle where there was this Canadian guy and he was a really good athlete, younger dude, good looking guy, built well. I thought he could eventually get to the top of the card. And he was playing this baby face, cheesy kind of Canadian character. And I immediately was like, dude, we're turning you heel because you're good looking and you're irritable. And, we're going to have you go against this other guy. And so the first angle that I wrote for this show was that this Canadian guy, he's in the ring or whatever, and he's doing stuff. And he had already kind of done some underhanded stuff earlier. And the guy who was going to be part of the story with him was supposed to run through the crowd and hop over the guardrail, get into the ring, and they would start going at it. And that would set up a match for the second episode of the show that week because we would tape 2 shows. So dude jumps over the guardrail, he gets into the ring, and he does this leapfrog, and he lands wrong, and he busts his kneecap. And he collapses. Now, when you're doing TV, even if it's not WWE, you still have okay, we got 30 minutes to do this show, right?
Yeah.
So if you're doing 2 shows, you got an hour, and you're doing some, you're doing just like WWE does. You're doing some pre-show stuff to warm up the crowd.
Yep.
You got dark matches or whatever.
Yep.
And then you go in. So this thing is timed, and so everything I had planned, it was all timed out to pretty much the minute. You could fudge it and edit it later, but you wanted to be as close as possible, so you didn't put it on the editor's plate to like just cut this thing
Up,
away.
yeah.
So it was a scramble, man, because that guy's down. We had to carry him out of the ring. I'm then going to the back. We had to get him to the hospital. Meanwhile, one of the main angle that would have led to, like, if it wasn't the main event of the second show, it was like the second, it was like the co-main event. We had to scramble and put together. So it was crazy. And I don't think the guy was great at business who ran the company, so it kind of just fizzled out. Yeah. But that was pretty interesting because it is cool. It's cool to like write something and you see people play it out.
Yeah,
it's kind of a cool thing. But yeah, man, if I had the time, I'd be doing a wrestling podcast at least once a week, if not multiple times a week. So
that is such a great story, by the way. I've got to get you out. Nick Cattles again joining the crossover. Find him on Sactown Sports, 1140 Cattles in Romney from 2 to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. Nick, this is going to be a tease. We'll have to get together again after a wrestling event because I have a massive in at the WWE. Oh. And we'll have to chop that up about that.
Yeah, man. I'm a huge fan, man. And like what Hunter's done since he took over, we don't really know what the whole situation is with Vince and how much he's got his hands in it. But I think anybody that watches it can tell the difference, the pacing, Absolutely. More wrestling. But yeah, I've always I always loved the idea of being a part of that world for at least a little bit. But it's tough. It's a tough shell to crack because there's a lot of people that want to do that.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's nearly impossible. I mean, you got to know somebody, and obviously you did. But we could do an hour show on Vince's mustache alone. Have you seen that thing?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's not the greatest looking mustache in the world. That's for sure. I would have the dyed hair and the mustache. I probably if I was close to Vince, I might have advised not to go that route. But he's Vince. I don't think he cares. He's worth billions of dollars. So whatever.
That's the thing. You don't advise Vince because he doesn't have an advisor. Exactly, man. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining the crossover. Really appreciate your time. Go check Nick out on Sactown Sports, 1140 Cattles in Romney.
All right, Ryan. Thanks, buddy.
You're welcome. Thanks, Nick. Have a great night.
I appreciate you, bud. See you.
You too. All right, that's Nick Cattles. What a great conversation. That one took a left turn, right? A little bit of wrestling. So that's going to be a tease for a future episode of the Sactown Crossover. I will let you in on my wrestling in. I'll let you in on the in. But again, a great episode. Get to know Nick a little bit more, get to learn a little bit about broadcasting, especially if you're an aspiring broadcaster. This is something you want to do. Give it a listen. Tell a friend that wants to get into broadcasting. Really, really good stuff. But so much to talk about in sports. We haven't been on for a couple of weeks, but we'll do a catch up here in the next few days. Nick and I touched on one of those things, which was Bob Huggins and some of the things going on around that. It's a difficult situation all the way around. Let's put it that way. And I'm not even talking about the people responsible in that situation. I'm talking, there's another situation. Not going to get into it. That can be an entire podcast on its own. But again, Sactown Crossover brought to you by Bennett's Kitchen. 3 locations, one in Sacramento, another in Roseville, and a third location soon to come in Rockland. Go check them out. They've got whatever you want. Amazing cuts of steak, prime cuts of steak, excellent seafood, a menu for everybody. Bring your appetite. Over 50 glasses of wine on the wine list. And, didn't mention Sunday brunch, prime rib, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Go check them out. Bennett's Kitchen, Sacramento, Roseville, and soon to come in Rockland. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the crossover. Again, major thanks to Nick Cattles for joining the crossover. You can catch Nick on Sactown Sports 1140 on the Cattles and Rami show, 2 to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. Go check him out. Lots of fun having him here. And that is it for now. Go check us out. If you are watching live, check the audio version out. You can find it on Spotify and Apple. Leave us a comment, subscribe. Really appreciate you. We'll get to Q&As next week. But for now, so long.